Hey guys, thanks so much for checking into another video here. My name is Galen and I'm an evangelist for Quixel at Epic Games. Today we're going to be doing a full Megascans ecosystem walkthrough, and I'm going to go over how you can take a realistic asset as well and convert it into something that can be stylized in nature as well using Quixel Mixer. So first of all, why don't we just jump in and kind of do a brief overview of what the library actually is, in case you guys are not aware, and then from there we'll actually jump into some of the applications and actually bring some content directly into Unreal Engine 4, which is going to be our main vehicle for this demo today. So if you're not familiar with the library and how it looks, this is Bridge. So Bridge is an application that looks very similar to that of the Megascans website. So if you guys have browsed our library just in going to Quixel.com and looking on the Megascans library, this is very similar. So you'll notice a lot of things that are actually very similar just in the way that the UI looks and the way that some of the displays are looking here. But what's really cool about Bridge is that we've actually added in a bunch of extra features here. So this is actually an application that you can download for free. And so what's nice about this is you can actually go and log in with your Epic ID to be able to get access to the entire Megascans library here for free. So all you need to do there is actually just go in and sign in. And then from there, you'll be able to have access with your Epic ID to every single thing that we're going to be looking at today. And that's not limited, by the way, to points or resolution of the assets or anything like that. Literally what that means is that as an Epic ID user, you can actually have access to every single thing here, download as many assets as you want from the Megascans library at whatever resolution you need for your project. So it really just lets you be fully creative in that regard. So why don't we jump into kind of looking at collections now. So collections is a really cool way to actually browse the library here. So I can actually go in here and actually see some of our users and some of the elements that they've actually made, some of the scenes rather that they've created, and some of the elements that make up those scenes. So not only that, but we actually do a fair amount of curation on our side as well, coming out with large packs of assets that are basically just grouped together based on either the scan trip or the type of setting that those assets might actually be in. We're also doing a huge amount of tutorial content here. So if you guys have seen the Goddess Temple or the Abandoned Apartment recently, these are some beautiful environments that some of our team members have made. And what's cool about this is that you can go into any one of these collections here, and not only can you get the links to the actual tutorial here, but it'll show you every single asset that from the Megascans library, at least, that was used in order to craft the scene. And what's cool about these scenes here as well is that we actually offer them entirely for free on the marketplace. So you can download this scene, take a look at it, really kind of get an idea of like how every single thing came together in order to actually make this type of really beautiful environment. So that's just one thing to note here. We have a huge amount of training content on our YouTube channel, so I would definitely recommend you guys go and check that out as well. So just in looking through some of the categories here, basically in collections, you'll notice that we have just a huge variety of different asset types here. So it's not limited to any one asset type in particular either. So you have 3D assets, you have surfaces, decals, atlases, really every single thing you could possibly need in order to assemble your world. And we're adding and expanding the offering here pretty significantly here. So, you know, as now we're a part of Epic Games, we're really kind of expanding into a lot of different content types that specifically people that are using Unreal Engine have specifically been looking for. So doing a lot more drone scans, looking at maybe capturing more HDRIs and these types of things. So we'll definitely be expanding the offering here in the coming months and years to come. So this is a really cool way to kind of browse the library here in collections. But what's nice here is that you can actually go back to the home page and you can see if you just want to look at sort of the daily scroll, new surfaces, new 3D models, or just things that are trending. This is where you would do that here at the top of the UI. So just going back to the home page and being able to see exactly what is kind of hot right now, what people are downloading. And from there, why don't we just go ahead and inspect one of these assets here. So I'll go ahead and click on this minecart. And what you can see here from this minecart is that we have a little bit of information that will kind of give us some indications of how we could potentially use this asset actually in our scenes. So just as an example here, I can see that the asset is basically this big in comparison to a human. So we have our little scale person here on the side. And then we actually indicate as well that it's a closed mesh. So this in contrast to an element that is open. So it might have a skirt that's attached to it at the bottom. This is something that is just kind of a nice indication here to be able to know what you're downloading before you even get it. So we can also go in and actually inspect all these maps even before we even go and download it here. So as you can see on the side, We can inspect Albedo, look at all the different elements that kind of make up this asset. And we can also actually preview this in 3D. So this will give us a nice indication of exactly what the asset looks like in the round. And this is just really cool because this allows me to take a look at it before I even go and download it. Just see if this is something that actually works for my purposes. So you'll be able to go and actually inspect that here. You're just using this 3D view here at the top. And then from there, you can actually isolate these individual channels here if you want. So if you just want to see the albedo, that's something you can do here as well. So what you'll notice here as well, if you scroll down into the asset info here, is that we actually have a similar grouping of assets in this similar assets tab here. So what this means is that we're able to sort of group assets together that are part of that same either scan trip or just elements that people are downloading that are sort of in that same grouping. So you might notice that there's another minecart here another minecart asset here that actually has, some big wooden planks that are in the back of it here. So that's one of the first things that's in the similar asset tab here. So it's just kind of nice to know exactly what other people are downloading, and then also what we're sort of recommending, I guess, as far as like what is a similar asset in that regard. So on top of that, you're actually able to go into our download settings. And this is really kind of where you can kind of get into the meat and potatoes of each of these different assets. And as you'll notice here at the top, we actually offer a huge amount of different types of assets in various resolutions here. So you can get the LOD 0, which is kind of our standard game resolution model, but albeit a little bit higher than maybe something you would use in maybe a current gen game, right? But you have all the different LODs that actually make up this asset here down below. So, and we also indicate here on the side whether or exactly how many triangles are actually a part of each of these individual assets. So you know exactly what you're downloading here before you even go through with the actual download. And then also we have our high poly source here on the side. And I want to highlight this because as we're sort of approaching the release of Unreal Engine 5, this is something that is really important for everyone that's using Unreal Engine to be aware of, is that not only are we offering these game resolution versions of these assets at very reasonable triangle counts, but we're also offering the high poly source assets for these as well. So what that means is that it's not just the geometry that actually is incredibly dense in detail here. So we offer up to 8K versions of each of these textures that you can load in as virtual textures in the engine. But what's really nice here is that we're actually offering this as a really kind of a premium offering, either for our film clients or people that are going to be using and shipping games in Unreal Engine 5 in the future. So what's really cool about this is that for this asset specifically, I don't know the exact figure on this, but my guess it's in the several million triangle range. So at least probably 2 million triangles for this specific asset. And it's unwrapped, obviously. It has all the different channels here that you need in order to fully assemble a material. And it's just ready to go at sort of next gen spec, which is really kind of a nice offering here. But what's cool about this here too is that if you're a film studio and you want to actually be creating something that is running in real time when you're actually just pushing pixels inside of the viewport, but you actually want to flip to that high resolution source when you're actually dumping frames for a film, let's say, this is something that's really, really nice for like a cinematic even, to be able to just flip to that highest LOD and be able to get a really, really high resolution model across everything that's in your scene in the Megascans ecosystem. So definitely something to be aware of here. I just wanted to kind of draw your attention to it. But we also offer, as you see here, multiple albedos, multiple normals for all the different LODs. So if you want to really, really make it so that each of those LOD changes are smooth as they can possibly be, then you would download the multiple albedos for each of these. Albeit it increases your memory footprint here, but it's definitely something that will overall increase the visual fidelity, especially when we're jumping between those different chains. So we also offer our source ZTL. So again, this is just a really, really dense geometry model here. So you can download that on the side. And then as you can see here, we have our download settings for each of our different maps that make up this asset here. So for Albedo, just as an example here, I can download my JPEG or the EXR. And then what's nice about this is that once I actually have it downloaded, I can actually go and export it to whatever type of compression or file type that I need. So as long as we have the JPEG or the EXR downloaded, we can do whatever we want with it. And of course, the EXR is kind of our gold standard here. So the 32-bit EXR is something that is really for if you're not really concerned about memory footprint, but you want the highest resolution and the best quality possible, that's where you'd get the EXR. So as you'll notice here on the side, I have my local tab here, and the local tab just shows me everything that I currently have downloaded on my drive. So these are just some of the assets that I currently have downloaded on my drive, and some of the assets that I'm hoping to actually demo with here today. So why don't we actually look at this guy? This is going to be our subject for today. And I actually want to export this now directly into a scene that I'm working inside right now. So I already have the plugin installed here. I won't go over how exactly you download the plugin. It's very simple though. So if you guys want, we can definitely post some documentation here about how easy it is to install the Megascans plugin. But just to quickly show it here inside of the engine, if you notice here at the top, we have this beautiful green button. And what's nice about this here is that this is our bridge into Unreal Engine. So all the content that we're looking at inside of Bridge is something that we can now bring into the engine with incredible ease. So that's really kind of the goal of working with Bridge, is that we have an application that really makes it incredibly simple to download huge amounts of content and export all of it into the engine, have our shaders hooked up, have our law chains set up, and just be able to start being creative as soon as possible once we're inside of the engine. So ultimately today, what we're going to be showing is just how easy it is to bring content into the engine. And then from there, we're actually going to go into Quixel Mixer later and kind of manipulate this asset a little bit in a couple different ways. So to start though, why don't we just go ahead and bring this into our scene? So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually go to the project location here. So I need to go to my project location and actually just browse to exactly where that is. And I'll just put it here at the top of content, and we can click select folder. And then from here, all that we're going to do, I'm just going to be exporting it 2K because I don't need anything crazy resolution to make the point, but I'll just go ahead and click export now that we have our project location set up. And I'll tab back over to Unreal Engine here. And what you'll notice is that we're going to get some loading here where we're importing the assets now into our project. And like I said, it's going to set up our material instance for us and the LODs if we export the LODs as well. So that's something that's really, really nice to be able to have, just to be able to literally start being creative as soon as possible. So from there, as you can see, we have our asset that we were just looking at, and we can start dragging it into our scene. And so as you can see, we have this material instance that's been set up automatically for us. And if I just go into the parent, this is actually where that material sort of stems from. So it's not a very complicated material, but it's just enough to kind of get you going. So if you're not familiar with shader math or anything like that at all, this is a really nice place to just start and be able to have some basic manipulation over this type of asset type. So if I go here now, I can actually take a look at the way that this asset sort of works with the shader here in mind. So if I wanted to, just as an example, I could change the Albedo tint intensity to maybe have just a different color associated with it if I wanted to. But there's a lot of different ways that you can start to just mess around with this. But ultimately, the point is just how easy it is to just generally bring this into the engine now. So as you can see, we have this asset now directly into our project, and we can just start placing it directly into our scene here. And we can move the light around here just to kind of maybe get some different shadows on this, just see how it looks in a couple different lighting scenarios. So that's basically it for this asset here. And the next thing I want to do here is actually bring this asset now into Quixel Mixer, where we're going to be doing some simple manipulations to this asset and just generally show how easy it is to start manipulating scan data and get a couple different results from it. All right, so here we are inside of Quixel Mixer, and what I'm going to do is actually load up that same Icelandic asset that we were just looking at and actually make some simple modifications to it by retexturing it. And what I want to do is actually retexture it a couple different ways. So why don't we go ahead and load it up here to start? So if I go to my setup tab and I go to 3D asset, this will show me all the different Megascans assets that I have locally on my drive. So in this case, we're going to bring in this Icelandic asset here, and it's just going to load it up into our viewport. All right, so here it is. And what we're going to do is do a couple different things in retexturing this. So what I want to do to start is let's do a hypothetical where maybe my art director comes to me and says, this asset looks great. We've placed it around the scene a bunch of times, but I think we can make some simple changes to it from a textural perspective that sort of bring it in line with more of what we're actually doing for our project. So we're going to do some really basic things here. And I'll just show you how easy it is to actually bring in a couple different scans to simply retexture this asset almost in no time. So what I'll do to start here, as you can see in the UI, it's a very minimalistic UI. We can make some simple manipulations to the base input asset here if we want. So we can go to Albedo. We could change the Albedo here inside of the viewport. We could change the roughness here to where maybe we want this to be a little bit more shiny. So you can make all types of manipulations here. And what's nice is that we actually have blending modes on a per channel basis here as well. So for the Albedo, we can affect the opacity, we can change some contrast, but we also have blending modes here at the top. So once we start to layer on some additional scans, it'll be really, really easy to go in, layer on some blending modes and just get some really unique looks from that. So what we're going to do is actually load in a couple basic materials on top of this in order to very simply retexture this guy in no time. So what I'm going to do to start is actually just isolate some different materials that I have in my library just to see what I think would be a good fit for the specific asset. So let's say my art director to start wanted me to maybe just replace the base material with something that fit a little bit better in the scene that we're working with. So I'll bring in this rough rock. And what I'm going to do here is just place this on as sort of our base. So what's nice here is that we have hexaplanar projection like we were looking at. And so what's nice here is that I can go into the placement of this asset and I can start to change the scale of how this material is actually projecting on the surface. So if I zoom in here, or if I just isolate the channel here, I can change the scale here just by moving up and down. And then also changing the radius and the height influence to figure out exactly how the seams are actually being hidden. So those are two really important sliders that are really great just to figure out how you actually want this stuff to start to blend together. And then we can actually change with the radial slider here exactly how that material is being projected on the surface. But again, it's tiling entirely, which is really, really nice. So once we land on something that we kind of like, we can just sort of move on here, but it's entirely non-destructive. So at any time, I can go back through and start to change any of these settings to get a completely different look. And if I have the source downloaded at a higher resolution, all the work that I'm doing will actually be preserved, and it will allow me to be able to export this at 8K if I have that source downloaded on my drive. So if I'm working here in 2K, every operation that we're going to be doing is something that can be non-destructive in that regard and bring it all the way back up to the highest possible resolution when we export. So let's start to texture this guy here now. So what I want to do to start is actually do a simple edge highlight of this. So I'll add in a different rock this time, and I want something that maybe is a little bit more chipped. So I kind of like this granite rock here on the side. And I only want this granite rock to actually be on the edges. So to start, we'll just drop it on the edge here, drop it on the entire asset, and then we're going to isolate it to where it's only on the edges. But first, let's actually manipulate the scale and start to change maybe the height influence and the radius of this to maybe affect how this is all blending together. And once we get something that we like here, and we change our radial slider to be something more in line with what we're going to be doing, I think this looks pretty good. So I think we're clear to move on here. But what I want to do is actually change the albedo here slightly to where it actually matches what's underneath. So what I can do is if I hover over the color swatch for albedo, I can actually click it first and I can manipulate it here this way if I wanted to. But if I hover over it and I middle click on it, this will actually give me an average and bring me closer to what the material down below has as far as the albedo intensity, color, everything like that. So this actually is a really, really nice way to start to blend these different pieces together. So I like to kind of use that average feature again, just by middle clicking over the swatch, and it will just bring me to that average point. And then we can start making some manipulations there. But we're going to bring it up slightly. We just wanted to kind of get it generally in that same range. And then we'll just raise the value here slightly. So that's where we are for this asset. But now, like I said, we want to actually isolate this to where it's only on the edges. So what I'll do is actually go to add mask stack here on the side just by right clicking on this asset. And then from here, I can go to add mask component and go to curvature. So the best way that I like to describe the mask stack inside of Quixel Mixer is that it's a nice blend between working inside of 3ds Max with the mask stack there and what you would get inside of the layer stack inside of Photoshop. So it's a really kind of a nice blend between those two. So let's drop this curvature component right here on the top. And if I hit 9 on the keyboard, this will actually preview what the mask actually looks like on top of the asset. So as you can see, this is actually just our default curvature that's loaded in with this asset. But what's nice here inside of Mixer is that we can start to make some levels adjustments and do this on the fly to where we're actually getting live curvature changes right here inside the viewport. And so just to sort of show what that looks like here, I'll just isolate just the albedo here. So now you can see exactly what we're doing when we start to make those changes just with the levels here. So what's really nice here is that you can see as I'm sliding this around, we're able to get some really, really nice results here. And like I said, we're just looking for that slight edge highlight. So it's just popping some of those edges a little bit. Now we're able to get something that is just a little bit more unique than what we had before. So from there, we actually have anti-aliasing that I can turn on here as well. So again, if I hit 9 on the keyboard, you can see this just kind of generally despeckles the curvature operation that we're doing here. So it's up to you if that's something you think that would be useful. But one of the things that's really nice here is just in sort of looking at curvature, there's a bunch of different ways you can actually start to manipulate this. So right now we're just using default, but I could actually go to edges only if I wanted to. And this will actually change the algorithm here slightly to where it's only going to accentuate those edges. In the same way, I can actually do that just for the cavities here. So as you can see, now we've actually isolated just the cavities. So this is inverted from what we wanted. But again, I'll just switch it back to edges. And then we have exactly what we're going for here. But I think what I'm going to do is actually just tighten this up a little bit with the levels and then also the tightness factor here. And then as you can see, we've got a really, really nice, believable sort of edge highlight that we can start to play with non-destructively later on. All right, so the next thing I want to do is actually add in the same way that we were just working with curvature, I want to add in a similar component now, but to the cavities. So this time I'm going to add in some simple moss. So if I go to my local tab here and I uncheck these guys, type in moss, then I can actually see that I have a couple of different moss options just locally downloaded here. I'm going to bring in this Nordic moss. And what's cool about this is, like I said, we're just grabbing materials off the shelves and actually just putting them right into our project. So we can mix and match and sort of just start to be fully creative here inside the viewport just by bringing in all these different materials and quickly retexturing this guy. So if I go to my scale here, why don't I find something that kind of works for what we're doing here? I think that looks decent. So now what we're going to do is again add in that mask stack, but this time I want it to be in the crevices. So I'm going to add in the curvature component once again, but we'll set it to cavities. And now as you can see, we've got some really nice moss buildup here that is just in the cavities. So one thing I want to do here though is that this looks decent. I think it looks good, but I think it looks a little bit too generated here. Obviously you can just tell that it actually is more of just a generated kind of curvature look. So what we can do is there's a bunch of different ways that we can do this, but we can stack different things on top of this, right? So what I'll do here to start is actually add in some simple noise. So I'll add in a Perlin noise to the top of the stack. And again, I'll hit 9 on the keyboard so we can see exactly what we're doing. But what this did is actually added in some Perlin noise. And I can change the frequency of this. I can see the values here to maybe get something different, change the octaves, do a bunch of different things to actually get me something that is noisy that we're going to use to actually mask out this component below. But as you can see, we clearly have these seams that are just not working for us. So if we were to layer this on top of what we did for curvature, it'd be really obvious that we have these seams here. So what we can do is actually take this procedural component that we just added, add a projection modifier to it, and we can change the tiling to actually have a beatbox projection. So now it's that hexaplanar projection like we were talking about, and we can change the height influence here and the radius to where we get something that is now a little bit more in line with what we were trying to do. So I can see the value here, change the frequency of this, but now as you can see across the entire surface, we're able to get this to tile and not have to worry about those seams that we were looking at before. So what I can do now is actually, I'm going to bring those octaves back because I think it's actually kind of nice. And we can start to play with the amplitude here slightly until we get something that works. But this isn't how we want our moss to be displayed on our surface here, obviously. So what we want is to actually do exactly what we were talking about before, which is use our blending modes in order to actually get this result. So first what I'm going to do is just click on the noise modifier here, and I'm going to set this now to multiply. And as you can see, if I hit 9 on the keyboard, you can see exactly what this does. So this is actually just taking away in the elements that we just had from the curvature below, and it's multiplying that on top. So think about just like that same blending mode inside of Photoshop, it does the exact same thing. So from here, I can affect the opacity of this effect, but this just breaks that up a little bit more from what we had. So it looks a little bit more natural. It doesn't look nearly as generated and game arty as we kind of had it before. So now we have something that's just a little bit more realistic for what it is that we're trying to do. So from there, I think that what we need to do is actually add in some gradients here and maybe some sand to the top of this. So what I'll do now is actually add in, let's add in another rock. So we'll bring in just another rock here. Why don't we do, let's see, I think we'll bring in this Icelandic rock here because it's an Icelandic asset, it just makes sense. So we'll bring this in. And what I'm going to do now is actually bring this more towards the bottom because I want this to actually be a little bit more of a gradient from top to bottom. And we want to keep that work that we just did with the edges here and then the moss there. So we want to preserve that work and actually sort of build on top of this now to make it a little bit more believable. So I'll change the value here to something that's a little bit darker, a little bit more saturated, which is kind of nice. And from here, what I'm going to do is add in another mask stack to this, but this time I want to actually do a position gradient. And so this time what we're going to be able to do is, if I hit 9 on the keyboard, you can see exactly what this does, is that this is actually just doing a gradient from top to bottom. So what we can do is we can affect the range here, but we want to invert this because I actually want this effect to be from top to bottom in a different way here. So we actually have the top actually have none of this asset, none of this scan, and then have a little bit more of it kind of creeping in from the bottom. So we'll just kind of have this generally here, but what's nice here is that we can actually set this to tilt with the asset here. So I can use the radial slider here in this to actually just sort of get it to adhere to this natural slope that we have here. So as you can see, if I go back to my PBR preview, just by hitting 1, you can see that now we have this really nice buildup of this different type of rock from bottom to top. So that's actually a really, really cool way to kind of add in a little bit of directionality. It's subtle here. It's nothing too crazy, but it's something I think just adds a really, really nice effect. So we can start to play with some of these other settings here, change the scale of this if we wanted to, kind of get just a different rock sort of on that surface. So we could take it a step further though, because right now, as you can see, again, it's very generated, right? There's just a very smooth gradient from bottom to top. And so what we want to do is actually break that up a little bit. So now we can use that same curvature component that we were just working with, but actually use it in a different way here. So what we can do is actually change this blending mode now till we find something that we think looks really good with what we actually have below. So I'll just sort of tab through these until we find something that we like here. Maybe overlay. Let's see what overlay does. So now, as you can see, we're adhering to the asset and we're actually bringing in some of the unique features of this asset that actually are going to play a little bit better overall, as opposed to just generally having just a smooth gradient. So I'm going to use overlay for this example, but again, we can start to affect the levels and get something really nice here. But I think that this is actually looking really, really good for our purposes now. All right, and so the last thing that I want to do is actually add in some sand here onto the top, because we had a little bit of sand on this, I think, before. So why don't we reintroduce that feature here a little bit on the top side of this. So what I'm going to do is actually go to add surface layer, and I'm going to type in sand. And I have a couple different sand pieces here. Why don't we add in this debris, sand debris asset here, and we'll put this at the top of our stack. And as you can see here, now we have sand in our scene. So what I'm going to do is actually change the scale of this here slightly to where we get something that makes a little bit more sense for what it is that we're doing. And from there, what this is going to need to do now is actually just be sitting on the top side. So we're going to add another mask stack to this, but this time we're going to add in a normal component. So normal does something that's very similar to the position gradient. However, it's actually pulling from the world space and actually getting us a completely different orientation for this based on how we orient this radial slider here. So we want this to be top down. So as you can see here, I just move this radial slider here to the middle, and then we can affect the range here to where now we're only getting it here on the top side. So I'm just previewing the mask, but if I tab back to the asset now, as you can see, we have sand now that's just kind of sitting on the top side of this. So what we want to do is maybe feather this a little bit, make it so it's a little bit more natural here for our purposes. But for the most part, just kind of generally bringing on that normal material or that normal modifier here, we're able to kind of get a lot of that work kind of out of the way. So what I'll show here at the top is now, since this is sitting on the top side, I'll show that blur underline feature that we were referencing before. So as you can see from this angle here, we saw a lot of that normal detail from the asset below. But if we drag the blur underline feature up a little bit, you'll see that we're actually kind of killing that normal information below it. So again, this is going to be something that you're going to have to play with a little bit based on exactly what you're working with. But sometimes something right in the middle is actually just enough to kind of get the best of both worlds here. But that's kind of a really nice feature to be able to have. And from here, like I said, is if we want to, we could go in and add in a curvature component on the top of this. And then this time we could actually set it to add, or some of these other different blend modes here to where actually subtract, I think would actually be perfect for this. So if I go here now and start to maybe just mess around with the levels of this, then as you can see, we're going to get something that just looks a lot more natural than what we had before. And we're able to get some really nice sand buildup on this asset here just on the top side. And like we said, I mean, this is entirely non-destructive here. So at any time I could go back and actually retexture this, change certain components to it that I think would work. But for now, why don't we go ahead and click save on this guy and we'll just call it rock. All right, and so what's really nice about this is that now that we have this asset in a place that we think it looks kind of decent, what we can do is actually take all the work that we just did as far as retexturing this asset and apply those same exact principles to a completely different asset. So what I'll do to show you that is actually just load in this different Icelandic asset now. So I can just load that in here like this, and then that same work that we just did actually will apply directly onto this asset as it's loading. And as you can see, we have that exact same work applied to this asset now, albeit there's a couple changes that we probably need to make in order to make this look a little bit more in line with what it is that we're looking for. Looks like the sand was kind of blown out a little bit for specifically how this asset is assembled here. So we can make some modifications to that. But ultimately, that same exact work that we just did as far as the gradient, the edges, the moss, everything is carried over. So we can take all those principles and actually save that as a smart material if we wanted to. So that's a really, really nice feature to be able to have. So what we're going to do though is actually flip back to our other asset, and I want to show how easy it is to actually now stylize an asset. So taking the existing shapes, the existing information from these scans and actually using it in a little bit of a different way. So like I mentioned inside of Bridge, what you can actually do is download the high resolution versions of these assets as well, and actually take those assets and really do whatever you want with them. So what I did in this case is actually go over into ZBrush and actually take this and smooth this asset out a little bit. So now, as you can see, it's just a little bit less frequency on a lot of the surfaces here. We've kind of rounded out some of the things that were going on. So it's really just a little bit more of a simplistic asset. And what I did is actually take this as my high poly source and projected that back down onto my low poly. So the same exact low poly that we were using for what we were just texturing, and I extracted a brand new normal map from that. So I'm going to load all that stuff now into Mixer, and you guys can see just how easy it is to now retexture this with a completely different lens. All right, so let's go ahead and load in that new rock now. So I'm going to call this Stylized Rock 02, and we're just going to make 2K. Make it 2K for right now, and I don't need to save my changes. We'll go ahead and load this guy into our scene now. So I'm going to go to Custom Mesh, and I'm going to I re-exported it just with a little bit of a different smoothing group setting. That's the only thing I changed. So I'm going to load in my low poly here, and this is what that low poly looks like with nothing applied to it. So now we go into our setup here, the base layer, and I'm going to go to my normals here first. I'm going to load in the normals. And I really encourage you guys to spend a good amount of time on your bakes, because every operation they're going to be doing inside of Mixer right now is entirely based on those inputs. So make sure that you spend a lot of time getting those bakes really dialed in. So I'm going to load in my occlusion map here as well, baked that out from X normal. And then I got my curvature as well. So I'll load that in. And those should be the only 3 maps that I really need in order to do a lot of what we're going to be doing for this. But that's kind of my jumping off point. So as you can see, this is a very soft kind of looking mesh. Again, it's kind of based on what we were looking at inside of ZBrush, of something that's really, really soft. And so that way we have a lot less high frequency detail on the surface. And it'll just allow us to do a lot more as far as stylizing this asset. All right, so once we have everything loaded in, what I'm going to do is now start to load in some base layers. So load in. All right, so now that we have everything loaded in, I'm going to go ahead and start loading in some solid layers on top of this. So I'll just add in a solid layer here at the top. And what that will do is actually just going to give me a different asset type from what we were looking at before. So this is a little bit different, like I said, in that it doesn't have any scan information associated with it. It's actually something that we're going to be able to just drag on some flat colors and start making some really, really simple changes to this asset. So I'm going to start by just loading a simple color here. So why don't we bring something into kind of this range, something that's a little bit orange, maybe a little bit brown, something that's just a little bit basic for what it is that will just be our base. So we'll start there. And from here, again, what I want to do now is actually start to add in some of the similar elements that we were looking at before with our last mix, but doing them here with base colors in order to kind of get that stylized look that we're going for. So what I can do here, like I said, is I can go and actually affect the roughness of this as well. So we can bring this into kind of our base range, something that's a little bit muted here like this. Nothing too reflective here, but again, we're looking for something stylized, so it's okay if we kind of push it a little bit. So I can actually duplicate this layer here just by hitting Control D on the keyboard. Now I'll actually just duplicate this exact asset in the stack. And so we're going to start with our edge highlight. So what I'll do here is actually just change the albedo here slightly, desaturate it, make it a little bit brighter. And then we're going to add in that same exact thing. So we're going to add in our curvature component. So this is one way we can do it. So I can load in my curvature here like this. If I hit 9 on the keyboard, as you can see, as we start to mess around with the levels here, then we're able to get it that way. Another way that you can do it if you want to load in something custom is actually load in a map here. So I can do that now. I can add an image and actually just tab directly to that curvature if that's something that I wanted to do. And then from there, I'm able to make some modifications to this. Again, just by affecting the range and then stacking other components on top of this if I want to really kind of get exactly what it is that we're going for. So let's just see how that looks generally here. So right out of the gate, we have some kind of nice edge highlights here. Again, just a really simple look here. So one other thing that I can do is actually go in now and actually add in some different changes to how this actually looks just by adding in some simple modifiers here. So gradient remap is a really cool one. This is an element that you could really kind of spend a lot of time looking at, but ultimately we can just kind of drag this in as more of a general contrast node and then remap some of the different frequencies here to some different curve values and stuff like that. So this is a really kind of nice way of manipulating maps here, but you can also just go in generally and affect brightness and contrast if you wanted to. So we can do that here just by maybe upping the brightness and again, affecting the contrast, trying to find something that's a little bit nicer. And I can append these different operations to what it is that I'm working with. So if I hit Alt and then click on this, I can make it so that effect, that brightness and contrast node only affects what it is that we've loaded in as our map. So that's just a nice way of kind of working. And again, once you start to get into a little bit more complicated stacks with a lot more kind of working against you, then it's kind of nice just to keep things organized and append different operations to them there. So just another way to kind of work there. But what I want to do now is actually affect this. Let's start by maybe changing the roughness. So maybe the edges are a little bit more shiny than the rest of this. Again, we're going for something a little bit more stylized. So it's all right if we get something like this. And again, now what we want to do is actually load in a simple gradient here. So what we'll do is just kind of duplicate this again. And then we'll change this to something that's a little bit darker, something that maybe is in a different range, maybe a little bit more red than what we were looking at before. And again, we're going to use that position gradient in order to kind of get us there. So I'll right click on this, add in our stack, and then I can go into position gradients. And then now we can actually have this to where this is inverted here. And now we have that nice kind of creeping hue kind of going from the bottom to the top. And that looks pretty nice right there out of the box. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So I'm not going to mess with it. I think it looks kind of decent for our purposes here. But what I can do is actually go into the albedo here, like I was saying, and I can change any of these blending modes. So I could say maybe add this to it. I could change it to where maybe it's overlaid. It's really up to you guys how you want to work. I just want to maybe feather the opacity here slightly to where it's not too overblown, but it still kind of gives us that nice look just from bottom to top here. So the next thing that I want to do is actually go in and bump out some of the crevices to be a little bit more, get some more hue in there, and also generally kind of get something that just makes the surface look a little bit more stylized. So again, what I'll do is actually just duplicate this the edges map that we were just working with, but we'll set this to cavities. And then from there, what we can do is actually just change this now to something that's maybe a little bit more green, maybe desaturated here slightly. But what we're going to do is actually change this to our curvature component, and then we'll set this to our cavities only. And so now if I hit 9 on the keyboard, you can see that we can get something that's a little bit better here. Just kind of recesses in the cavities here slightly. And again, it's just going to give us a little bit more color in this and something we can generally play with. So again, tightness is something that we can mess around with here. But again, this is just a really nice way to kind of bring in a little bit more color into what it is that we're doing. So I'm kind of happy with that. I think it looks decent. But again, I'm just going to go in and probably change some of the features here, maybe like the roughness, maybe bring that back up into something that isn't, nearly as reflective. And then also in the albedo, maybe just change the opacity of it. So that we're just introducing a little bit of color here, nothing too overstated, just adding in some additional color variation to the surface. And one thing that I want to do next here is actually add in some nice like textural information that I could have done in ZBrush, but I actually want to do here inside of Mixer for a couple different reasons. And I'll just kind of generally show what that would be. So what it is that I'm going to actually project some really nice kind of imperfection detail on the surface here, and then actually get that to sort of be a rock type texture that actually displaces the maps here slightly. So I'll just kind of show it and just kind of generally show exactly what that texture can be. I just wanted to kind of get a little bit more breakup on the surface and introduce some cooler tones to the surface. So what we'll do here to start is just add in another solid layer. And I'm only going to be working with maybe the albedo, the roughness, displacement, normals. I don't need occlusion or anything like that. And I want to bring this into maybe like kind of a desaturated kind of blue here. But what we're going to do is actually now add in a mask stack, and we're going to do a couple different things that will kind of bring us to exactly the look that we're going for. So what I'm going to do is actually load in a map to start, and we can load in library assets, which is really, really nice. So I can browse the library here. And if you go to your imperfections tab, you can see we have a bunch of imperfections here that do a bunch of really cool things for us. So I'm going to bring in this stains imperfection, and I'm just going to be working on one channel here. So I'm going to bring that guy in right now. All right, so as you can see now, we've brought in that stains map that we just were working with. And as you can see, this looks very bizarre right out of the gate. This isn't exactly what we're going for. So I'll generally kind of bring this now into that range of what we're trying to do. So what I'm going to do is actually just invert this here to start. And what this will do is actually show just how we have this nice kind of blue texture here on the surface. So this is part of the way there. So why don't we start to build on exactly what it is, that effect that I'm going for here. So what I'll do to start is actually go to the scatter modifier. And what this will do is actually go in now and scatter this on the surface. So what's really cool about this is that we can affect angle range. We can affect the seed of this, affect the size to where we get different size of this actually on the surface here. You can change that from 0 to 1. So we get maybe more that are kind of in that same general range, or we can have it all the way from 0 to 1. So pretty diverse and wide range here. So what we'll do now is actually add in a projection modifier on top of that. And what we want for this is now to be set to box projection. So box projection here now, if I go now and affect the radius and the height influence, is that now we've got this really kind of cool splatter effect on the entire surface of this blue. And it's actually going to break up not only the albedo like we were talking about, but I'm actually going to offset it here with some displacement as well. But let's again start to make some modifications here. Maybe affect the range here slightly to where we get something that is just a little bit more in line for what we're trying to do here. So I'll affect the range here slightly. And what I can do is, like I said, we can go in to start to add in some of these brightness and contrast nodes even. It's going to get exactly what it is that we're going for. And then I can also go in and maybe blur this effect here. So I can make a Gaussian blur here. So now we're getting something that's a little bit more pronounced, something that isn't as noisy as well. So now we have this, again, kind of cool splatter effect on the surface. And it all tiles, which is one of the coolest things about this here. So I can go up to my projection and now affect the scale of this. And as you can see, it's going to continue to tile on the surface, which is one of the coolest features of the projection modifier here on the top. So the next thing I want to do is, like I said, I want this to now have an effect where this is actually displacing the surface here slightly. So I'm going to change my blend mode to from above. And what I can do is actually change the threshold of this and affect the wrap to underline. So I can actually change this now to where if I have it to where it's less of the wrap to underline effect, as you can see now, what we're getting is some nice detail on the surface. So like I was saying, this is kind of giving us now a little bit more of a different texture from what we were working with before. And so what we can do, see how it's kind of chipping away at that surface now. So again, we can go into our individual channels now and feather this effect here. So I want to only maybe introduce a little bit in the albedo here, but now this is kind of unifying the look of this asset a little bit more than what we had before. And again, now I can go back through and start to change some of this non-destructively. So I can go back through and maybe blur this a little bit more than what we had before, kind of bring it more in line with what it is that we're trying to do here. So now we've got this kind of nice like pitted look on top of the surface here, and we can reintroduce some of that hue back in now. So just affecting the opacity here slightly. And again, we can set this now to maybe overlay to where we're kind of playing with some of those values down below as well. And we can also go in and start to make some modifications for this as far as kind of bringing it more into that kind of stylized vein just by affecting just how this is actually cutting in with the displacement here as well. So I can change the strength or the opacity of this. So now it's a little bit more, it looks a little bit more integrated here. Same with the normals. I can go in here, affect the opacity of this here slightly to where now it just kind of feels a little bit more natural from what we're working with. And again, affecting the strength here as well. Just trying to find something that generally works, something that's a little bit more natural for the surface here. But I think in general, we've kind of now brought it into a little bit more of a stylized look from what we had before. All right, so as you guys can see, we were able to now take this asset that we had already retextured in a different way with smart materials, and we can now actually take this asset that was a photorealistic scan before, and we're able to retexture it here inside a mixer very quickly to be able to get something that's now completely stylized in nature. So I really hope you guys learned a lot from this today. If you have any questions, we'll be hanging out in the chat down below. So if you have any questions about anything that we covered today, definitely feel free to drop us a line, and also be sure to follow us on all of our social media platforms. Like I said, we produce a huge amount of training content on all those platforms. So we really hope that you guys join us over there, and can't wait to see what you guys come up with using Quixel Mixer in the Megascans ecosystem. And again, my name is Galen. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks so much.